In this recording, we're going to review the integration article that's available in the resource library at curity.io. It's a fairly comprehensive integration guide. I'm not going to go through the details of that here, but we're going to look at what the result of configuring Apigee and Curity following that guide looks like. So the first thing is that this integration leverage something called dynamic client registration. So that is something that needs to be enabled in Curity. And we have a set of clients. If you use the example configuration, we have a dynamic client template available. This example configuration is referenced in the integration guide as well. So with that, we have a setting that says users must authenticate, and it's going to do so using the authentication mechanisms that are available in this www client, which is also available here. If you look at that client, it's configured to use, in this case, an HTML authenticator. In addition to that, the configured flows are the code flow and implicit flow. So those are the two that would be supported in this scenario. That could obviously be different in other configured scenarios, but it's what's available in our example configuration. The other part is that we need to configure a client registration endpoint like it's done here. This is also referenced in the integration article. If we now switch to OAuth tools, I have a couple of flows here. We first need an access token. I'm going to use the www client and request the DCR scope here. We'll run that and I get an access token back. This is our initial access token that is needed in order to run the next step, where we are going to register the client with Apigee and with Curity. But we are calling an Apigee endpoint configured. So we're calling a client registration endpoint on Apigee, and Apigee will proxy the client registration in Curity. So we can see here that there's a client registration endpoint configured in Apigee. And what we will do here is we'll use our initial token, and we are going to send the software ID here is the dynamic client template. That's the client that we want to register. And we also pass in a developer that's configured in the Apigee side. The response from this, from Apigee but proxied from Curity, is a client ID and a client secret. This is the dynamically registered client. So we can use that client ID and client secret further. If we look now what happened in Apigee, an application within Apigee was registered using parts of our request, so the dynamic client template, but also parts of the newly registered client that corresponds to our client ID that we got back here. The next step is to get an actual access token for the API, and this is where we use that dynamic client that we just registered. So we are going to copy the client ID and the client secret here from that response. That's what we use as the client ID and secret. I'm requesting the OpenID scope here. If we look in the system in Curity, there's another piece configured here. We have an Apigee token publisher. So before I send this, what happens is when Curity gets a request for an access token here, it will actually pass that on. It would send that on to Apigee so that Apigee can register that token. So we have an HTTP client here with basic authentication. And it sends it to a token endpoint in Apigee. This token publisher is available on the Curity GitHub repo with instructions for how to package it and deploy it. So we deploy that into Curity so that Curity can register the tokens with Apigee. So if I run this here, what happens is we get an access token. We also get a refresh token and an ID token because I requested OpenID scope. But this access token was now registered in Apigee so that Apigee can validate this when we use this for future calls to the actual API. We can then call our actual exposed API that Apigee exposes. So I have a records API here, very simple. We can call that with our access token, but as you can see here, I got an error, insufficient scope error. The scope's OpenID are insufficient. So I only requested the OpenID scope, but to exemplify this, we can now rerun this. So I'm going to request the records scope as well. I get a new access token. Again, this is registered with Apigee. If we now use this new access token and call the API, we now get a successful response. And that's because within Apigee, we've configured that for this specific records API, you need the records scope in order to perform a GET request. If you look in the architecture here quickly, what actually happened is that the client first requests an initial access token from Curity. It then uses that to register a dynamic client, but it's proxied through Apigee and registered. Then we can use that dynamic client and ID and secret to request an actual access token that is then registered with Apigee. This token is what we usually refer to as a phantom token or opaque token. So Apigee can use this to introspect the token or dereference the token to instead get an access token in a JOT format that contains some additional information or more information. And this could contain PII information about the user that is then passed on to the backend API, allowing the backend API to leverage that more enriched data, the PII information or more detailed information on the user, to provide further fine-grained authorization decisions within the API itself. The full guide for integrating with Apigee Edge is available in the resource library at curity.io. Let us know if you have any questions or comments. Thanks for watching.